Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Eline Holtslag, and I'm an Incubation Specialist at Royal Pasgeform. Today I'm going to talk to you about egg breakout analysis. Now before we start, I want to tell you that this webinar contains some polls that I would like to get your opinion on. If you have any questions during these presentations, you can put them in the chat and we'll try to answer them. And last but not least, after this webinar, we will send you a webinar replay link and you will get the handouts to this webinar as well. So let's start. The content of today, I am going to be talking about good hatchery results, what that entails. I'm going to talk to you about hatchery calculations, some examples, egg breakout procedure, so how to do it, egg breakout interpretation, also important. You don't just want to do it, but you also want to know what it entails, dealing with data, and also, last but not least, I'm going to give you a summary. So, good hatchery results. What are they? What do you think is good? You might think high hatchability is good, or you might think good chick quality is good. Maybe you're happy when your customers are happy. I think all of them are good quality, but they do entail some different things. Now, if you look at high hatchability, how would you measure high hatchability? There are multiple ways. So you can talk about hatch of egg set, hatch of fertile, or even dead in shell. The most important thing is not that you do it a specific way, but that you know how you are doing it. So you know what your calculations, what your data is actually meaning. So that's the most important part on how to measure it. So what is good chick quality? You might want to measure it by the percentage of culls. Maybe you are performing PASCAR scores often. Maybe you're looking at the weight of the chicks or the chick yield. And the chick yield is actually the weight of the chick in relation to the weight of the egg set. Or maybe you answered for yourself, well, I'm happy when my customers are happy. That's also fine. Your customer probably is the happiest if the first week mortality is very low, or if the 7-day body weight is very high. But this you can measure best by just a silent telephone. If your customer is not happy, he will probably call you and you would find out immediately. So maybe it's best if you don't hear from your customers because they're satisfied. Now, let's start with a poll. Are hatchery results always good? And if not, how do you find out? Now, if you're answering this with, my results are always good, I don't believe it. You cannot control everything and nothing is ever perfect the way it is. Sometimes accidents happen. So if it's not always good, how did you find out? Did you find it because the problem was reported to you, either by personnel or maybe the customer? Or did you do data analysis? Or maybe even a visiting consultant? So how do we find out when it's not good? Like I said, maybe your problem is reported to you by personnel or maybe a customer. This is usually something that stands out. A high number of unhatched eggs, or maybe the chick quality is low. Someone will immediately see it and will report it back to you. Sometimes, actually, it might be less obvious at first. And then data analysis can really help. If you have data over a longer time, you can actually see, for instance, a downward trend or maybe even an upward trend. You can compare this with your hatchery other data to see and find out where some problems are. Or maybe you had a visiting consultant. So what's the first thing to do if your hatchery result is not good at this moment? The first and foremost thing to do is to find out if it's an isolated incident or not. If it is an isolated incident, like I said, your hatchery personnel, we're all human, mistakes can happen. So it might just be an incident. And if it's an incident, you don't have to go look at all the data, you don't have to do so many extra stuff. So you will save yourself a lot of time. But if you find out that it's not an isolated incident, you actually see it, it's a recurring problem, or maybe you've been seeing it for a while and it tends to get worse, you really need to find out where this problem is coming from. So what can it be related to? I've listed a number of things. There are multiple things that have an influence on your hatch result. This by far isn't all, but for instance, the breeder flock can have a big role, can be a big relation to your hatchery results. Or maybe is it the flock age? Do you see that every time that a flock ages, you see a problem arising? Maybe it's egg quality. Maybe you're thinking these aren't the best eggs that I'm setting, or maybe there's a recurring problem with your egg quality. Maybe it has to do something with egg storage. So you see that there's a trend that if you store the eggs for a longer time, you also see a decrease in your hatchery results. Or maybe you can even find out that it's machine related. Maybe you can see that if the eggs are always coming from setter 1 or hatcher 1, this is where the problems are occurring. So you can actually go back to that machine and look at what that machine settings are and find out if there's something you can do about it. So sometimes it's very easy to spot. Sometimes you see immediately there's something going wrong here, but sometimes you need to use data analysis. So if we look at data analysis, I have a schedule here, a graph, that shows the hatchability of 2 breeder farms compared to an overall hatchery average. So we see different bars with different colors. So the gray one is the hatchery average, and then we have the red and the yellow bars for farm number 1 and farm number 2. On the x-axis, we see the flock age in week, and on the other side, on the y-axis, we see the hatchability. So we see that a very young flock that's just starting production doesn't have the high hatchability yet, but we see that it goes up pretty fast. If we take a look at the flock age from week 40 up to week 60, we can see that the yellow farm, the yellow bar, is actually performing better than the hatchery standard. So that's a good sign. If we take a look at farm number 1, the red bar, we can actually see that it has a lower hatchability than the hatchery average. Now this could be a farm that you need to look into. Maybe there's something going on here that you can improve. Another thing that happens a lot, whenever a consultant is visiting you, they always find out stuff that you didn't realize you had. It's completely normal. We all get a kind of a blind spot. If we work in the same hatchery for over a year, you might find some things to become normal. But if then someone other than your personnel comes in, like a consultant, like someone from Pasreform, maybe we can actually find something that you're saying like, oh, I've seen this over for years, or maybe this is normal for me, that we can actually tell you that this is not normal, or this we can improve. So it's very important that you have regular visits and that we can actually give you some help. Now let's start with hatchery calculations. Can we rely on hatchery calculations, or do we need to do breakouts? So that's a question from me to you. Do you think calculations are enough? Or do you think we need to do egg breakouts as well? Now, let me explain what I mean, and let me explain my answer to you based on a number of calculations. This is an example of a calculation of a hatch of fertile. So we've set 100 eggs. We see that 9 eggs were clear. If we want to, and we see that the total chicks are 87. If we want to calculate the hatch of fertile, we see a lot of people calculating the hatch of fertile based on the first class chicks, 86 in this incident, in this case, divided by 100 minus 9 times 100, we see that the hatch of fertile is actually 94.5%. But is that correct? Are we talking truly about hatch of fertile or not? Now my answer is that this was actually a calculation of hatch of transfer. Because if we were to do a breakout, we would actually find out that the 9 clears that we used in the calculation before weren't actually all clears. Now we see that 5 of the 9 were actually infertile. We saw that 3 were dead, early deads, and then 1 was mid-dead. Now if we were to calculate the hatch of fertile again, we would do it by different numbers this time. We would actually use the number 5 instead of 9, because we know for sure right now, because we did the breakout, that there are 5 infertiles instead of 9. You can use both of these calculations. I'm not saying the first one is wrong. The hatch of transfer can definitely tell you some information, but it's important to know what we're talking about. So if someone is telling me I have a hatch of transfer of 80% or 90% or maybe even higher, then I need to know what that calculation is based on. Is it based on clears, or do we truly know the infertiles? Now, next calculation. What about the candling accuracy? So we've already calculated the hatch of transfer and we used the 9 clears. But what if you were to find out by a breakout after hatch that one of the eggs that didn't hatch was in fact not a late dead, but it was already a mid dead? That egg should have been removed during candling. So actually we need to adjust this calculation again as well. So if you want to calculate the hatch of transfer, we would actually need to use 10. So the 9 clears plus the one that the candling accuracy, the candling machine actually didn't detect. So now we see that the hatch of transfer is actually 95.5%. It's a small difference. However, there is a difference. And again, we need to know how you calculate your hatch of transfer. Now another example, dead in shells. The dead in shells is often calculated. So we take a look at the number of eggs set, 100 in this case again. We subtract the 15 clears, and we subtract also the first class and the second class chicks. That would lead us to a 10% dead in shell. But if we did a breakout again on these dead in shell, maybe we were to find out that the dead in shells were not all late deads. We could actually find that there were 5 clears in this example and 1 mid dead. These are not really considered with the dead in shells. They shouldn't be calculated. And you see, if you look at these two compared to each other, we see that the 10% would lead to a big question. You might think we have a big problem, we have to look at it. And if you do a breakout, you could actually see that the dead in shell is at least less of a problem than you thought of. And maybe your candling should have been better, or maybe you didn't candle at all and you want to have a more accurate calculation. Now, how to do an egg breakout? Some aspects I really want you to consider. How will you do an egg breakout procedure? When will you do this? What do you want to break out? And how many do you need to break out? So how do you do your breakout? First and foremost is that you have trained personnel doing this breakout procedure. We need to know that if we are looking at breakout data, that the data is correct. If you do not have trained personnel, they might think that a early mortality was actually a mid-mortality, or maybe they see some things different than you would think. And then again, you would be talking about different things if you were looking at the same data. So it's important to train your personnel in order to both agree on what you're seeing. Now it's good if you have your breakouts done by the same people as well. It's kind of the same issue. If you have 2 or 3 people performing breakouts, you never really know if they're all agreeing with each other unless you train them together. But if you have a lot of people performing breakouts, I assure you that some people think differently about it and the data could lead you in the wrong direction. Now, random sampling from a machine is very important as well. We do not want to grab the first basket that we see, or the basket that has the least dead in shells, or maybe you grab the basket that you think, oh my God, these are really a lot of eggs. Now we don't want to actually choose a basket. We want to do it randomly, so we get an even view of what is happening. So if you want to do a random sampling, I would say get a basket or a tray on top, somewhere in the middle and somewhere in the bottom. I wouldn't use the top one or the very bottom one, but let's say use the second from above hatcher tray, or let's say 3 from the bottom. Or maybe you're thinking, I need to do a breakout procedure because I have a suspicion that something is always happening in one machine, or maybe even one spot, or maybe even one flock in a certain spot. You can choose not to do a random sampling, but then you have to do it consciously because you need to know what you're trying to look at. If you're having suspicion that something is going wrong in the left side of the machine, of course you can do some more sampling on that side compared to the right side because you want to know what's going on. But in general, I would say do random sampling all the way through the machine. Another thing that's important is a standard summary. If I were to tell you the 3 things that I thought most suspicious, you might not get the data that you would want. And so it's nice to have a standard summary that every time an egg breakout is done, we will always get the same summary, so we would always get the same data. Now, a poll. What is the best timing to do a breakout to find infertiles? Is it a fresh egg breakout? Is it after a couple of days of incubation? Maybe that is 3 days of incubation, maybe you like 10 days incubation. Or do you think the best timing is after hatch? I will get with the answer later on. Let's continue. So when to do an egg breakout procedure? I'd like to see it done on a routine basis. I really like to see a hatchery specific reference data to know what's going on in your hatchery. This is also, it can function as an early warning. If you see that one of the flocks is not performing as well as last week or last month or maybe even longer ago, you already can tell that from early on based on your own data. In case you have a problem, you can find the cause and take correct action. Or maybe you want to do it because you adjusted some settings and you want to actually judge the effect of this action. Now, what can we break out? There's a lot of eggs in your hatchery. We can break out all of them. You would have no chicks whenever. So let's not do that. We can break out a few eggs from fresh eggs. Then we can look at the internal quality, the embryo quality. If you're already doing a breakout of these eggs, you can also directly look at the fertility and the stage of the embryo. You can also do a breakout after 2 or 3 or maybe 10 days of incubation. Some people find it easier to find out the true fertility after a couple of days candling because you would get the blood ring. However, it's not always infertile if you don't see a blood ring. So that can be a bit tricky. You can also do a breakout procedure after candling. This would allow you to see both the fertility and the mortality pattern, as you can already see some of the early and the mid deaths. You can also do a breakout procedure after hatch. That would give you a fertility and a mortality pattern, and also might give you some clues about other losses. So what is the best time to do a breakout procedure? It really depends on what you're trying to find. I think the best timing to find an infertile is with fresh eggs or after a couple of days of incubation, because if you leave the eggs in the machine for the whole 21 days, we see that because of the heat for 21 days, we see some protein denaturation, and that might actually lead to you thinking something else has happened to this egg. So maybe you see a very dark egg and you think it's rotten, but maybe it was just a mid-dead embryo, but because of the time in the machine, it looks very different. So it's important to think that if you break out an egg after candling or after hatch, let's say a 3-day-old embryo has died, that looks very different after candling than after hatch. So how many eggs do you need to break open? As few as possible. It will save you a lot of time, it will save you a lot of eggs if you don't break open all the eggs. However, if you really do as few as possible, as least as possible, if you only break open one tray or one basket, that doesn't really tell you anything about the whole batch itself. So we do need to know that we have to break open some. I'd say 1 or 2 isn't enough. We also need to know from how many eggs set is this sample that you're taking. If you've opened some clears or unhatched eggs without telling how many eggs you originally set, it doesn't tell me anything. Because if you open 10 eggs and you found 10 embryos died on day 3, you could think that's a big problem. But maybe you only opened 10 eggs out of 100,000 and they all happen to be on that stage. So you have to know how many eggs were originally set to ensure that you are that you know what you're doing, that the percentage that you're actually seeing is correct or incorrect. Now I have an example showing how many eggs to open. We had a client that was quite surprised about our statement of how many upside down embryos would die in the later stage. So what he did was actually he put up his own experiment. He had 7 different hatches and he set the eggs upside down, 300 eggs upside down and also 300 eggs normal. And then he just calculated the hatch of fertile. Of course he saw the difference between those upside down eggs and the normal eggs. And he also did an egg breakout procedure to find out that all these eggs, or a lot of these eggs, the high percentage was in the late dead. Now if you show that in a graph, you can actually see that the eggs that were put upside down, we see a high mortality, especially on the older flock ages, comparing to the normal set eggs. Now if you translate that to how many eggs should I open, this is an example of the number of baskets that you could open to try to find out how big of a problem that you have. So imagine if you're setting 10% of the eggs upside down, you would actually see a hatch loss of 1.6%. If you calculate that based on a tray, let's say a 150 egg tray, that would actually be 2.4 eggs. Now, if you were to say I open 6 trays, and you open the first tray and you see 3 eggs that were upside down that didn't hatch. Okay, this is a bit high. Let's check and let's find out the others. And then the second tray that you open is actually 0, and the second one after that is actually 1. So you think, oh, that's actually not that bad. If you combine that, that's okay. But if you look at tray numbers 4, 5, and 6, they actually have a high percentage of upside down that didn't hatch. And if you were to look only at these baskets or these trays, you would actually think that the problem is way bigger than it is. So it's very important that you open enough trays, enough baskets, enough eggs to find out the average. So how to perform a breakout procedure? Of course you need some tools. You need something to open the eggs. I don't mind if that's a teaspoon or the side of your table, as long as you do it with care. You also need some empty trays to put the eggs on that you've just opened. It can be, or it can come in handy to have Petri dishes. If you cannot see the exact stage that the embryo has died from the top of the egg, you might want to actually open the egg completely in the Petri dish to see the embryo in whole. Of course, you need a recording form to write down everything that you find. It's better if you do this by a computer than by hand. Last but not least, and very important, you need tissues, because if you're going to break open a lot of eggs, it's going to get a dirty business. So what about the staging? I want to tell you about staging, and I can talk for hours about staging, but I think that's not the point of this presentation. So let's keep it short. Candling breakouts can look very different from residue breakout. Like I said, you have protein denaturation, the temperature that is where the eggs are in for a long time, it can actually show very different. So for example, if you break out a candling egg and you see some red from the blood ring, after 21 days, because of protein denaturations, the blood doesn't look red anymore. It kind of looks more like brown or blackish. So it's important that if you do your breakout after hatch, you need to realize that things can look different from the pictures that you're used to. Now, my advice for breakouts is to open at the air cell first. If you open at the air cell, the embryo tends to float on top. Especially if it died in the early stages, you can see this just by opening the top. Now, for the more advanced embryos, if they've incubated for a couple of days longer, you might want to open the egg because you cannot see it anymore because they're not floating on the top. And it's very important to say it's not necessarily infertile if you don't find any signs of a blood ring. The first 2 days you don't see a blood ring. We see other things that I will talk about later. But it's not necessarily infertile if you don't see a blood ring, even after incubation. So, something very important, something to be aware of while I'm giving this presentation, is that I usually give pictures of embryos that are at certain days, at certain stages. But when you break open an egg, it never looks exactly like these pictures. Why not? Because an embryo or a chick is a live animal. It changes. So also the development, it changes gradually over time. So every hour, every minute, or even second, something is happening with the embryo. Something is changing. It's growing. It's maturing. So if you have 2 eggs that you open that were, for instance, on the exact same time, they might still look a bit different because we just have individual differences. Remember that it is or it was a live being, so it happens gradually. So day 1 and day 2, what we see if we break open these eggs is namely the subembryonic fluid. We can see it, the left picture, we can actually see that normally where the embryo is a nice round white ring, that it actually fans out a little bit. So the edges become less clear, but it also looks a lot bigger. If we take a look at the other picture to the right, which is taken on day 2, we actually see way more subembryonic fluid. If you look at this picture, maybe even half of the yolk that is visible right now from this point of view, you can already see the subembryonic fluid. Also in day 2, you can see the starts of some blood formation. So it isn't unusual to see some red dots or a little red string, but it's not as clear as day 3, where we have a beautiful blood ring visible. So this stage, I think everyone agrees with me, this is very easy to see. If you see this, you immediately know that this at least has passed day 3, the blood ring is visible. If we go all the way up to day 8, we can see the egg tooth. So the little white dot on the beak of the embryo, which is the egg tooth, the embryo will use it later on to break out of the egg, is already visible from day 8. Another important thing to look at if you want to see if it's below day 8 or above day 8 is that the upper and the lower beak have the same length. Day 14, a little bit harder to distinguish already. We see that the embryo is actually turning towards the air cell. So where the embryo was first on its side, we can see that it's actually moving upwards in the air cell. Day 18 and 19, we can see that the embryo is getting its head under its right wing. The beak is going up towards the air cell, right on the right spot to pip later on. And sometimes people ask me, I find it hard to distinguish between day 18 and day 19 because they want to distinguish whether the embryo has died in the setter or in the hatcher. So I see why this can be a problem if you have problem defining this. Because if the embryo has died on day 18 or day 19 and you have a lot of them, it can actually point you towards the machine in which the problem occurred. So maybe if you transfer at day 18 and a half and the embryos have died at day 19, you can actually look at the hatcher and you can skip the setter all over. The main difference that I look at if I want to differentiate between day 18 and day 19 is the yolk resorption. So at day 18, the chick is starting with its yolk sac resorption, but the yolk sac is still flexible. If you're on day 19, the embryo has actually taken up more of the yolk sac and you can actually see some tension. It actually is more of a round bulb outside of its body cavity. You can actually see the tension that it's almost all inside. Now, the last days in the hatcher, I'm looking at the two drawings on the right. The middle one is the internally pipped one. I think we can agree that this is quite easy to distinguish. If you open the egg at the air cell and you can already see its beak coming through, your embryo has already pipped internally. If you look at the egg itself and you can also see kind of a crack-like formation on the egg itself and you open it, you can see that the embryo is really trying to push open the eggshell, which is the external pipping. Now, of course, we also have a recording form for this. You can do an egg breakout as extensively as you'd like. Some people just really want to do it the quick and dirty way. They want to write down the early, the mid, and the late deaths. There's lots of more categories that you can use. Let's say we can distinguish between day 1 and 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, every day, so on. You don't have to do it. It's an option. It might point you into a direction that you didn't know if you only do the early, mid, and late, but it's not required. Now let's talk about the egg breakout interpretation. So this is a recording form for fertility and embryo quality upon receipt. And you have to know, if you're opening the egg, what you're looking at. If we take a look at the unincubated fertile and infertile egg, on the left side we have two examples of a fertile egg. We see that the shape is actually nice and round, the edges are very clear. And if you compare that to the egg that is infertile, so the right picture on this slide, we see that the infertile egg actually has a very irregular spot, a white irregular. It's also a bit smaller than the fertile egg. So if you compare these, you should be able to tell the difference. If you're just starting with it, it might be a bit harder, but just focus on it and try to repeat it and you'll become good at it in no time. Now, the residue breakout interpretation. You can compare it in different ways. So one way is common sense. If you are doing a breakout and you think, my God, this is a lot of eggs that have died in this stage, it's a problem, you know it. On the other side, you can see it by a hatchery specific reference. You can compare those. If you think maybe today I saw a problem, but you compare it to the hatchery specific reference, you can see if you're right, or maybe it wasn't that bad as you thought, or maybe this is the start of something. Another thing that you can do is actually compare it by the standards of a breeding company. On the bottom is by courtesy of Aviagen. You can see that they actually have written down the number or the percentage of all the different stages of development for different flock ages. So then you can compare your data of today with, for example, this data of Aviagen, and you can see if you're actually up to the standards of the breeding company or maybe below or above, and you can find out if there is a problem. Now, what is the cause for all these embryos to die? The troubleshooting list can point into the right direction. However, I'd like to say that there are so incredibly lot of causes that is extremely difficult for me to immediately say, if I see this, this is the cause. So you can look at different types of literature. There are a lot of people that have written literature about this topic. We have a troubleshooting table in our Pasriform incubation guide, but to give you a kind of answer, I can say that if we see a lot of early mortality, it usually has something to do with suboptimal egg storage or ununiform temperature or a lack of turning. If we look at the mid-dead embryos, these are mostly from suboptimal setter temperatures, the nutrition of the hen, or also contamination. And if we take a look at the late mortality, these are often transfer problems or suboptimal temperatures. If we do a residue breakout, it is important that you have a correct interpretation of rots. A lot of time customers saying these 3 are rotten, but if you really open them up, you might find that one of them was just an embryo that had died, which actually looks kind of funny. After 21 days in the machine, of course, the embryo doesn't look as nice and pink anymore. As I said before, protein denaturates and it can lead to a bit more brownish, blackish embryo. Also important is cracks. Now, you can have cracks before setting or during transfer. And if you do some residue breakout, you can actually distinguish between those two. Now, if you see cracks from before setting, we usually see that the air cell is pretty large because the egg has actually lost a lot of moisture during incubation. If we see that the cracks were actually from during transfer, it shows more often than not that the shell membranes are actually attached to the embryo itself, so the membranes have already dried out as well. We also see dehydrated eggs. These have a lot to do with the shell thickness. So often when we see dehydrated eggs, this is coming from a very thin shell. So it's important to not just look at the data, it's also important to observe and recognize malpositions as well. So it's not just quantitative. If you look at the examples here below, we can see that one of the embryos is actually upside down. This way it has a very hard time to reach the air cell. We see another embryo that actually has its head between its feet. And the third one is actually the embryo that doesn't have its wing over its head. We see actually that this one has its head over its wing. And this embryo also has a lot of trouble with pipping because it cannot really turn around very smoothly. There are other things as well, like abnormalities. There are a lot of abnormalities that can occur. A couple of them, for instance, are crossbeak. We can see maybe more than 2 legs, so 3 or 4 legs. We sometimes see an embryo with 1 eye. These are important to write down as well. So it's not always just about the rough data, you also kind of want to zoom in sometimes. So breakouts, we talked a lot about the embryo, but it's not only the embryo, it's also the shell. This was the home for its embryo for 21 days. So we can tell a lot about these shells. If you take a look at the left picture, we see two shells. The above shell is actually pipped, let's say at the middle of the egg. It's pretty low, so we could assume that this egg has actually lost quite a lot of moisture. The below one, the egg, is actually pipped at the right side, at the right height. If we take a look at the right picture, a lot of times you would see people crushing shells in their hands. This is also to look at the humidity of the hatcher after hatching, just to see if these shells are also dehydrated or not. The amount of meconium on the eggs also tells us a lot. So on the left side, we see a lot of eggshells, but they're pretty clean. On the right side, we see that there's actually a lot of meconium on these eggshells. If we look at this, I would say that the chicks from the right picture were actually longer in the hatcher after hatch than the chicks would have been on the left picture. So this can actually tell you something about when the chicks actually hatched and whether your pulling off time was correct or not. Now, dealing with data. How to store and analyze data. Data is a very important thing. We can do all the breakouts that we want, but if we do not store and analyze the data correctly, you cannot really tell anything from it. A lot of the time I see customers that use spreadsheets for each day. So they have a hatch day from Monday or Tuesday. They have it on separate sheets, which actually makes it a bit harder to compare the data. So a continuous data table with all the variables and all the values in one is actually better. But there will be a webinar of this topic as well. And if you're very interested in how to deal with data, you can look at that. So in summary, hatchery results are not always good. There's no denying it. You can do it as perfect as you want. You cannot control everything. Hatchery results are simply not always good. Hatchery calculations might not always be reliable. If I tell you my hatch of fertile is very high, but I do not show you the numbers, maybe I did a wrong calculation, or maybe I just did a different calculation. Maybe we're talking about hatch of fertile versus hatch of candled. So it's very important to know the differences. Breakouts provide extra valuable information as well. Because if we just look at the general numbers, the eggs set, the chicks hatch, it doesn't tell me as much as an egg breakout can. And a breakout can be as extensive as you like. So maybe you're going for the quick and dirty way, you just want to do the early, the mid, and the late. Or maybe you just have the time for it and you actually want to dive deeper in it. That's also fine. And that was it for today. Thank you for watching. The webinar replay and the handout will be sent to you shortly. There's also a knowledge section at our website, so be sure to check that out. And I'll see you at our next webinar.
Royal Passery Farm for the highest number of best quality chicks.